Thank you, everybody. My name is Barbara Kachwa. I'm from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We'll be turning to the first panel on the economy and political reform. Ambassador Sarukan mentioned a whole number of issues that we will hopefully be talking about more in depth. Mexico is obviously confronting a number of strong challenges. Mexico has been the darling of the international economic community for many years. Member of the OECD, member of the NAFTA free trade agreement. At my institution, we look at the big, important emerging markets, the BRICS Plus, that are members of the group of developing countries that have GDPs of more than $1 trillion. We tend to look at it at PPP rates, but also at market exchange rates. This past year, Mexico, in terms of market exchange rates, has taken a bit of a sabbatical. We imagine it will be rejoining us later this year or in the next year. It still does have a GDP of more than $1 trillion at PPP rates, but it is facing a number of both internal and external challenges. Last year was the worst performance in terms of the economy for Mexico in over 30 years. The Mexican economy fell by about over 6%, and it's also confronting a number of strong institutional, political, and social challenges. So we have three very well-qualified panelists to talk about this. Starting from the far end of the table, we have Luis Rubio, who's the Director General of the CIDAC, the Center of Research and Development in Mexico City. He's also a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson's Mexico Institute, and was the former advisor to Mexico's Secretary of the Treasury, among other prominent policy positions. He's currently on the board of directors of the Human Rights Commission of the Distrito Federal, and as many of you probably see regularly, a very strong contributor to Reforma, among other publications. So we'll have Luis Rubio talking. Andrew Seeley is the director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Mexico Institute, which is a co-sponsor of this event. He's also an adjunct professor of government at Johns Hopkins University, a board member of the USMexico Fulbright Commission. All of these people are so accomplished, I can't catch my breath. And he's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Tyler Cowen is a professor of economics at George Mason University. He's the co-author of the Marginal Revolution blog, which deals with the economic perspective on just about everything. So he's also a book on Mexico, on markets and cultural voices. He's one of the few economists who deals with issues like literature and art. He deals with issues of just about everything from an economics perspective. So I imagine we can throw some good hardball questions at him and he'll bounce them back. He's also the author of Create Your Own Economy, The Path to Prosperity in a Disordered World, most recently. So we'll start with Tyler. Obviously, 2009 was a challenging year. The question we're addressing here is, has Mexico turned the corner? Mexico has faced a huge external crisis, right? Big effects from the U.S. or the global major recession, coupled with internal challenges, the swine flu, narco trafficking, narco violence that was discussed. Some really important political reforms that are taking place that will have an impact on the economy. A couple of questions for you to consider. Has Mexico tied itself too strongly to the U.S. economy? Ambassador Sarukan mentioned some of the benefits of NAFTA, integrated supply chains that allow Mexico to do business relatively seamlessly with the United States, its largest trading partner. And there have been some criticisms recently of Mexico's strategy. Mexico has tried to diversify. Mexico is now in a strategic partnership with Brazil and looking for other markets. Has Mexico paid too great a cost for its strong ties with the United States? Has Mexico turned a corner with the recovery in the United States? Consensus reviews for Mexico's predictions for Mexico's GDP have tended to be revised upwards for this year from about 3.5% to a little bit over 4%. Are we seeing Mexico doing better? Has it turned a corner? And if it's turned a corner, where is it going? So Tyler, if you could address these small specific questions.
Thank you. I've long been a Mexico optimist, mostly because I've always been impressed by the creativity and work ethic of the Mexican people. I think the key question to ask about Mexico is, can the quality of governance improve, or have we seen it improve? And here I think there's a long list of evidence that the quality of governance has improved a lot. I would start with the swine flu response, which was maybe slow at first because of the weakness of local public health institutions. But once it was in place, it was swift, it was decisive, it was actually extremely altruistic toward the global community. It was done with a fair degree of political unity, and arguably the intermediate levels of the response were done better in Mexico than they might have been done here in the United States. And this to me is one of the great underreported stories in the world in the last year or two. One can look at small issues. So air quality in Mexico City, it used to be among the world's worst. It's still far from ideal, but now it's tolerable much more frequently. And you may or may not think that's an area of intrinsic importance, but the point is there was a big problem. It required collective action, and more or less Mexico has succeeded in solving it. The recent legalization of gay marriage in Mexico. Again, the important point is not that this is necessarily intrinsically a major issue, but it shows that norms can change in a fruitful or a modernizing way. The entire response to the global economic crisis, one can imagine if something like this had happened 30 years ago, ways in which it would have set back Mexico. But I've been struck in a way by how small an event it has been ideologically for the Mexican people and the Mexican state. And some of the core economic developments we've seen come about in the last 10 years, like having a pretty well-functioning mortgage market, that just does not at all seem to be in jeopardy. Mexican democracy does not seem to be in jeopardy. Probably Mexico will be growing at over 4%, or is already. And just the kind of seamlessness or automatic nature of the changes, that Mexico was hit by some pretty big blows, swine flu and the economic crisis, and has bounced back without it being a major news item. So in these cases, I see the dog that didn't bark as the major news, and I think a lot of us have been underestimating the good news implicit in that. If I think about what has happened to standards of living in Mexico so far, I'm a big proponent of the thesis that Mexico has already grown much more than we are able to measure. And I think if you use consumption data rather than income data, you can see this. I myself once did a fieldwork study. I went to the Mexican state of Guerrero. I went to the Rio Balsas region, and I collected consumption data on what people consumed in the early to mid-1960s compared to what they consume today. And if you know anything about the Rio Balsas region, it's highly indigenous. It's called sometimes very backward, which I don't think is exactly accurate. And it's viewed as a part of the world that hasn't progressed very much. And in a lot of economic growth statistics, it basically shows up as a zero. But if you count consumption data, which I tried to estimate by interviews, from the early 60s onwards, I had this one village, ordinary village, growing at a rate at about 6% on average, which is not China's 10%, but it's actually pretty good. If you go to kind of a normal shopping mall somewhere like in or near Puebla or Veracruz, not the biggest cities, but you just go to a shopping mall and look who there is buying things. To put it bluntly, the number of dark-skinned faces just walking around shopping as if absolutely nothing is new is astonishing. And again, this is a very big change from Mexico in the 1980s. I think in the last 30 years, Mexico has just made astonishing strides, and these are very often overlooked. I know the drug war is a big issue, and as an outsider, this is something that is hard for me personally to follow. But just one or two remarks on that. In the long run, I find it very hard to believe that the Mexican state, with a PPP GDP of $1 trillion behind it, will be outgunned by drug lords. I don't know how we'll get to the better outcome. It's not my area, but I'm pretty confident in betting that we will. One of the most interesting facts about Mexico is that for a country of its sophistication, it undercollects taxes as a share of GDP. This is well known. Everyone knows why this is the case. Who enjoys paying income tax? It will be hard to make the shift. But most other countries, once they've reached Mexico's level of per capita income, have made the shift. It can be done. It will be done. And once the tax collection ratio goes up, I'm simply convinced the Mexican government will, one way or another, even with zero aid from the U.S., be able to beat the drug cartels. I also look at the drug cartels. I know they kill a lot of people now. I don't see them as so fearsome. I think economically speaking, they're potentially the next General Motors, the next Lehman Brothers. They have a product. They're not really getting any more productive. They face a lot of competition, basically from chemistry. Crystal meth is one competitor. But transporting whatever from Colombia up through the United States is, even now with imperfect enforcement, to put it mildly, a big pain. And the notion that you can make something better in a lab, by a teenager living somewhere in central Michigan is maybe in the long run their biggest enemy. And the cocaine market hit its peak a long time ago, and it's past maturity. And I see that as a declining market, and it's going to shrink, again, without worrying about exactly whether my government does the right thing there. So the drug war is a huge problem. Like next year, it may not be better. But 20 years from now, I think it simply has to be much better under any plausible scenario. So that should be dealt with, but it doesn't ultimately worry me. 2 or 3 things that do worry me about Mexico, and I don't think they'll be easily solved, these problems. The first is the gradient between level of education and expected wages. And this maybe is the fault of the United States. But one way to do better financially, if you're coming from Mexico, is to move to the United States, whether legally or not. And a large percentage of the Mexican labor force does exactly this. What's very striking in the data is that to move here with an education, with a high school or college education, you're not really likely to earn much more than if you move here with very basic skills because of the kind of jobs you do. So the wage gradient for education for Mexican labor, looking at all jobs which Mexicans get, including jobs in this country, that's a remarkably weak gradient. So the bottom line is the financial incentive for Mexicans to become better educated is much weaker than we would expect for an economy with Mexico's per capita income. And this is because of the United States. It's not our fault. U.S. jobs are paying money to a lot of Mexicans, and this is overall a good thing. But this is, in my view, maybe the single biggest problem that needs to be solved, and it really won't be solved in any swift way just by having enough growth. That gradient needs to become steeper. So right now, education is a huge problem in Mexico, and the pecuniary returns to it just aren't there, and they're not going to be there anywhere soon. And I worry about that really more than the drug war. Second, Mexican civil society. If you look at different metrics, say for volunteering, Norway usually is first in the world, and Mexico comes pretty close to the bottom. I actually think Mexican civil society is pretty robust. It's robust in different ways. But there are still a lot of ways in which trust within Mexico isn't nearly as strong as it should be. It's much better, but there's just a long way to go there, and it's like there are 2 sets of norms within Mexico. And the strength of the norm that within the country there's just not a lot of trust, that in my opinion is still way too strong. And it stops a lot of problems from being solved, including the problems having to do with taxation. Finally, I'll just say remittances are an issue. Remittances have been falling, like the ambassador. To me, that's not a crushing issue. Remittances fall. The exchange rate moves. Mexican exports do a lot better. And that tends to be somewhat of a wash, more is commonly realized. Remittances are a kind of Dutch disease for Mexico. In closing, I'll just say in the last 15 years, Mexico would have done much, much, much better if not for China. China's been the main competitor. China will either rise to riches or fall apart. My view is actually the latter, but it doesn't matter which one. Under either scenario, Mexico will make up the ground it's been losing to China. So most of all, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about future economics for Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's great to end on an optimistic note. You mentioned a couple of issues that are interesting, and many of them have to do with Mexican institutions. The tax collection issue, which hopefully, as you predict, will be solved eventually. There are a number of institutional changes that have been made that have led to some of the bases for your optimism. And I'd like to turn to Luis Rubio to see what you think. You've been following the changes in Mexico for a long time. You've been thinking about them. What kind of institutional changes still need to be made? President Calderon has put forward some institutional changes. He has a 10-point agenda that he's put out that includes universal health care, that includes the new push towards reforming the competition law. Today we saw the statistic that 41% of Mexicans are still not covered by any sort of health care. This is an issue. Education is obviously an issue. Ambassador mentioned re-election of Congress people. What changes are needed to make Mexico turn the corner in a positive way in the short term? In the slightly longer term, what will it take for Mexico to ever make some of these tough decisions in terms of institutional changes that might also address things like the capacity to continue to be an oil producer, for example, rather than going to becoming an oil importer in the next 10 to 15 years, as is some people's fears? Mr. Rubio.
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's quite obvious that Mexico needs reforming in any number of areas. But the real question in my mind is whether reform today is possible or even desirable. The real issue that Mexico confronts is an issue of power, how to divide power, how to divide the spoils of power, how to distribute the monies of society. Those issues have not been addressed, and those are the issues that really lie underneath every single discussion, every single debate, every single piece of legislation. And the problem is that the kind of reforms that are being proposed, even though nominally they're in most cases the ones that Mexico needs, the fact of passing them would not necessarily make any dent in reality, while they would be disqualified by people as saying they didn't work. There's sort of a high propensity in the country to try to comply with the checklist. We need a legislation on re-election. We need legislation on an antitrust. We need legislation on this and the other. Once it's passed, we check, we mark the space, and we've done it. And if that were enough, Mexico would be the most developed country in the world, because we've passed lots of reforms in the past 20 years, and they have not complied or not resulted in what was proposed that they would. And I believe that one of the big consequences of this is that the whole notion of reforming has been undermined as a result of non-delivery. Reforming for reform's sake makes absolutely no sense. What seems to me to be obvious is that the key is to determine and define what needs changing, why that needs changing, and what do we want to see as a result, and try to make sure that whatever is written in the reform, in the law that is passed, has the potential of actually changing society. Let me give you just one example of why I'm skeptical of going the route that Mexico has taken lately. I'm a firm believer in re-election and in checks and balances. That's not something difficult to become a believer in. However, if one understands how Mexico's political system operates, the owners of the political parties at the state level, at least, the owners of the monies that the candidates use, and the owners of the electoral institutions at the local level are the governors. So who's going to determine who gets re-elected? The governors. It's not the people. This is not a reform about the people. It is a discussion about how to redistribute power within the parties and among the politicians. Therefore, simply passing a law to re-elect members of Congress would not settle absolutely anything. In fact, most Mexicans are opposed to re-election, and the reason is interesting. The polls say when people are asked whether people should be able to reward or punish politicians, most people, 60-odd%, 63 or 64%, are opposed. If the question is posed, you would be able to punish or reward politicians, then about 45% of the people are in favor. It's interesting to see that simply most people want to punish politicians. They don't want to reward them. There are several sets of proposals in the docket. The president's is one, but it's not the only one, and odds are, because of the composition of Congress, particularly more than the Senate, that the reforms that might be considered are those of the other parties, not those of the president. But nonetheless, some are serious and institutional, and that could be said of most of what the president has proposed, and of most of the 8 point proposal that the PRI has proposed in the Senate, but others are very vindictive in nature and certainly one-sided. But the important thing here is that most of them, for most of them, if not for all of them, the common denominator is that they all respond to the calculations, the short-term electoral calculations of the parties and politicians about A, who can get to power, or B, grabbing as much power as possible in case they don't get to power. There is a fundamental underlying dispute here about who's going to be the nominee, particularly within PRI, for the presidency in the year 2012. And that leads a good chunk of the Congress to be in favor of those things that support a candidate, particularly the today governor of the state of Mexico, who at least in the polls, the most likely candidate of the PRI. But there are others who support the notion that that other candidates might be there. In whatever the case, some of the powerful members of the PRI are trying to secure enough power for themselves wherever they end up being, so that they can control the monies or the procedures or the mechanics of power for the next administration. The point is simply that nobody is thinking in terms of how do we build better institutions. They are thinking in terms of how do I secure a stay in power. The context for this is key. There are major reforms being talked about among parties that barely talk to each other. More important, they live in different worlds. This is something I read from an interesting article in a December issue of a Letras Libres magazine. I never thought of this, but I always perceived it, but I never really began to focus on this. The Mexican political parties don't even agree on where they stand today. What's the reality today? A simple example. Is Mexico a democracy? If you ask members of different parties, they will answer something different. The members of PRI will answer, Mexico has always been a democracy. The answer of the Panistas will be, we are a democracy since the year 2000. And the answer of the PRD types is, we were yet to be a democracy. The point is that as long as that's true, then we're not even speaking the same language. We're not even in the same time zone. And that explains why they are simply trying to get some better package for themselves, rather than thinking in terms of how they will deliver to their alleged representative, the people they represent. In these circumstances, it is impossible to agree on fundamental issues of institutional development, because they are not thinking in terms of institutional development. They are thinking in terms of power grabbing. Compare this with the Federalists. It's that contrast that one should bear in mind when arguing about these points, because we are not talking about the same thing. We're talking about not how do we build a nation, which is what the rhetoric says. It is how do we grab more power for ourselves. The coming of democracy led to the entrenchment of powerful interests. This concept that is more American than Mexican, than the ambassador touched on, which is the evolution of power, is true. But in Mexico, the power was always granted from the federation to the states. What we are seeing is the dismemberment of the old presidency, and power that was concentrated in the presidency went away into the political parties, the leaders of the parties in the Congress and the Senate, and the governors. The governors became the feudal lords. There's the joke that Mexico is the only country in the world that has gone from monarchy to feudalism. But the interesting thing here is that there were a number of groups, interests, unions, clusters of power within PRI that were part of the system, of the old PRI system, that went on their own after the loss of the presidency in 2000, and they have become what Mexicans very comically call de facto powers, poderes fácticos. De facto powers meaning those interests that have a life of their own, and they are there to protect their interests and therefore protecting the status quo. And those are big unions like the oil workers union, like the teachers worker union, some big businesses. Slim is a de facto power in and of himself. And there are any number of other such interests throughout the country, and they, of course, would include some of the narco mafias. And in this context, reforms are and will be relevant as long as the issue of power, and again, wielding power, distributing the monies, and creating checks and balances do not work. Mexico has developed some checks on power, but no balances. And it is the combination that is fundamental. Yes, the Congress does stop the president from passing legislation that he wants. And that is in stark contrast with what used to happen. I can go into details, but that's not the point at this time. The thing is simply is that the need to introduce reforms is obvious. The question is whether those reforms are possible before the issues of power are settled. And the political parties today are not ready for that settlement yet. Until that happens, reform is going to be elusive. In the 19th century, there were big fights within Mexico. The liberals against the conservatives, the then liberals against the conservatives, the Europeanists against the Americanists, the centralizers against the federalists, the monarchists against the Republicans. These were successive and sometimes overlapping debates and discussions. At the end of the day, one group won and imposed its visions and its laws. And they basically copied first the American Constitution in 1824, and then other laws from France. That was the other example. And those were imposed on Mexicans, having absolutely no bearing on Mexican reality. What happened? The first agreement thereafter was to agree not to abide by those laws. 200 years later, things have not changed that much. We're still in those debates. Obviously, Mexico has changed dramatically, and many of the things that Mexico has advanced are extremely significant, and I'm not trying to disavow any of this. It's simply that reforming in the current context is really not in the cards, and it ultimately may even be pernicious.
Well, thank you. Some important insights on the political process and some of the potential barriers to reform. I'll be interested in a little while to hear what Tyler Cowen thinks about this and how you respond to some of the more pessimistic, since you've set yourself up as the optimist economist. But first, I'd like to turn to Andrew Seeley, who's been following the U.S.-Mexico relationship for quite some years. This relationship has some big challenges at this point. There's a small but somewhat vocal group of legislators calling to pull out of the NAFTA on the U.S. side. The SPP seems to be diminishing in importance, and yet NAFTA continues. We have some trade disputes that are still unresolved, hopefully on their way to being resolved. In this context, and given the financial crisis of the past years, what can the United States do? And keeping away from the security issue that our colleagues on the next panel will get into thoroughly, but what can the United States do to help boost Mexican economic development? What type of cooperation efforts? What do you see as possible, and what do you see as desirable?
Well, thanks, Barbara. First of all, let me say, on behalf of the Wilson Center, we're very pleased to be able to co-sponsor this meeting, and it's great to have two of our board members, Diana Negroponte and Luis Rubio from the Mexico Institute, here as well. I am the only person at this table, I think, who is not either an economist or a political economist. So I'm on shaky ground here talking about economics. But as Barbara said, we do follow the U.S.-Mexico policy discussion very closely. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and hopefully can jump into some of the issues that have been raised in the bilateral context. Let me start off, though, if I can say, I wanted to say a couple things about the Mexican economy, since this is a meeting about Mexico turning the corner or not, and what is around the corner when Mexico turns the corner. I, like Tyler, am an optimist. I mean, overall, I have to say I tend to, and I think many of us who follow Mexico from abroad tend to be more optimistic than our colleagues in Mexico. We miss the play-by-play, the frustrations, the ups and downs of policy making. We see things evolving over time in snapshots. It means we have less of a grasp of the subtleties of what's going on, but I think it makes us often much more optimistic about what's happening on the ground, for better or worse, or maybe we're a little bit ingenuous. One of the things, let me point out just three things that I've been, I think are sort of interesting to note about the Mexican economy that are positive. One is, if anyone has recently eaten Thomas English muffins, Entenmann cookies, Maybe you made a pizza at home and used a Boli pizza crust. Maybe you drank some Borden milk the other day. If you're on a diet, you might have had some Weight Watchers yogurt. Maybe you're adding to your house and use some ready-mix cement or some other cement. You're using Mexican products. This is something that would have been unimaginable 5 or 10 years ago, and for the most part, 5 years ago. Not Toyotas, however, yes. It's hard to tell what this means, but right now, industry leaders in 3 areas: cement, which is not a surprise, that's the one that's been around the longest, is Cemex; milk, dairy, actually, in the United States. The industry leader is a group called Lala, out of Torreon, Coahuila, in northern Mexico. A large company in Mexico, but not one of the usual suspects you would think of. And Grupo Bimbo, which is a very large company in Mexico, largest baker in Mexico, is also the largest baker in the United States. They've bought up companies, U.S. companies. There has long been Mexican investment in the U.S., but it has always trailed far behind U.S. investment in Mexico. It still trails far behind, but we are seeing a change in that trend to some extent. And this has happened very recently. Now, because 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 Mexican companies are doing very well in the U.S. does not reshape the Mexican economy, but it is a fact worth noting, worth thinking about. It's one of those trends that has been underreported and is interesting. Second thing, a trend that has been interesting to watch, despite, and I don't mean to in any ways minimize the hardship that people have gone through in the last year and a half in Mexico, 7% contraction of GDP. Nonetheless, having lived through the 1994, 95, 96 crisis in Mexico, the economy has a resilience it didn't have back then. We've not seen the same kind of panic, the same kind of collapse of financial institutions, the high inflation. To some extent, there's a certain resiliency, and Tyler, I think, was referring to this. I mean, a certain state capacity here that perhaps wasn't there before. And though it sounds unrelated, I couldn't help thinking about this when the Mexicali earthquake hit the other day as well. I mean, really severe earthquake hit near major urban areas. Yet Mexico did okay with this. And it speaks to a certain state capacity out there. As many, and we'll get to some of the negative things in a second, as many things that can be dragging the economy down, there's a certain stateness in Mexico that I think is developing over time that is worth noting. And finally, I mean, there's been a gradual drop in extreme poverty. Not an eradication of extreme poverty, not as clear a drop in poverty overall, especially if you take into account what happened last year, but in extreme poverty. And part of that is Oportunidades, the social program that transfers resources to people in extreme poverty. Part of it is remittances, which is essentially a self-help mechanism to deal with extreme poverty. But it is notable nonetheless. That said, let me point out a few worrying signs as well, and then we'll go into the U.S.-Mexico dimension. I think overall I'm an optimist. There are signs, and some of them Luis referred to, that call out for attention. One is slow growth. Mexico is a chronic underperformer. It is a regular, until last year, had regularly been moving ahead in GDP growth over the past 10 years, but always at a slow rate, always much slower than other countries, and certainly Mexicans would wish. It is clearly an economy that is still, Luis referred to as run by de facto powers. You would call them based on monopolies and oligopolies of power. And this is true in politics as it is in the economy, as it is in many facets of Mexican life. And it's a heritage of the corporatist system that was there for many years. But clearly it is an economy that still is based around, you're seeing Mexican companies become increasingly competitive outside of Mexico, but Mexico inside is not necessarily as competitive. And this is a major issue. And this is true for business. It's true for labor unions, which are neither terribly democratic in their practices, do not terribly represent their workers terribly well, and also drag down competitiveness. You see this in education, where there's a teachers union that does not particularly represent its members, but nonetheless manage to have a huge influence on in resisting changes in education policy. Third, worrying sign is that though there's been a great attention to reducing extreme poverty, and I think it's actually very laudable, and it is something worth noting, there's been less investment in recent years in productive activities that can move people out of poverty. So you're seeing extreme poverty go down, poverty moving much less so, and some of the subsidy programs are profoundly regressive in the way they're applied. So still some concerns around that. And finally, obviously, remittances, though as the ambassador pointed out earlier, remittances have been incredibly important for poor areas of Mexico. There are also negative effects on this. Remittances ultimately are not a development strategy, and they haven't necessarily, they've provided a very good means for some people to move out of extreme poverty, but they haven't become a detonator for development, and there hasn't been much thought given yet on how to do that. So a brief overview. Overall, I'm an optimist. I think the positive outweighs the negative. Things are moving forward. That said, there clearly are, we don't want to be over-optimistic about the situation. Let's move into the U.S.-Mexico context. I mean, clearly for Mexico, the United States matters. Most of the issues we're talking about here and that Tyler and Luis have raised are issues that Mexico needs to deal with. In the end, Mexico's economy will be dealt with by Mexicans. That said, the U.S. is the destination for 80% of Mexico's exports. It is the largest source of foreign direct investment. It is a country that has an enormous weight in Mexico's daily life. But the reverse is also true. Perhaps not to the same extent, but the reverse is very much true. Mexico is the second largest destination for U.S. exports, about 13% of U.S. trade overall. China has moved ahead of Mexico in total trade, but only because of the great number of imports to the United States. Clearly, the U.S. Migration is a major issue, driven to a large extent by lack of opportunities. And clearly, the U.S. benefits by having a stable and prosperous neighbor. So there's a great interest in the United States in seeing Mexico move ahead. It's good for our economy. When Mexico moves ahead, it also helps our economy jumpstart, and it helps to have a neighbor that's in a good situation. And clearly, for Mexico, while Mexico would like to diversify its opportunities, reaching out to Brazil now, looking at signing a free trade agreement with Brazil, signed one recently with the European Union a few years ago, looking at Asian markets. Clearly, the U.S. is the dominant trading partner, and so what the U.S. does matters. What's possible? Let me lay out 6 things that I think we could do together that would be interesting. 3 of them are actually practical. 3 of them can be done today. To some extent, we're doing them already. We can do them more. And 3 of them are highly impractical. How's that? Or at least they're ideas for the future that we can build upon. The first one is low-hanging fruit, which is economic dialogue. And it's low-hanging fruit because, of course, we talk to each other about economic policy. Our treasury ministries talk to each other. Our central banks talk to each other. The presidents talk to each other. But I don't know if they've ever talked to each other as much as they have recently. And that's a positive, and it's something we don't want to lose. And it's particularly noticeable in a time of crisis. I think one of the things that has been also a hidden story in this economic crisis is how much the Treasury departments have talked to each other, how much the presidencies of the 3 countries of North America have talked to each other, how much the central banks have talked to each other, trying to avoid surprises, trying to make sure that as industries like the automobile industry are remodeled, reshaped, it doesn't have negative impacts on the other countries in the North American region. I think this is a huge area that we want to continue to carry on. And part of what's happened actually with the North American Leaders Forums, which happen every summer, is that they've become one of those forums that makes this happen. And it's sort of a useful, there's no longer the SPP in the structured way where there's sort of specific, nitty-gritty issues to deal with, but there is this larger dialogue going on, and it's important to preserve that. Secondly, and this is one that is starting to happen in new and interesting ways, but you hear President Obama talk about doubling U.S. trade, doubling U.S. exports. Well, the easiest way you can do that is with Canada and Mexico. The easiest way to do this is about 1/3 of our trade is Canada and Mexico, is to figure out how you can expand that relationship. And the low-hanging fruit there is one of the largest bottlenecks we have is infrastructure and transportation. When you have trucks sitting for 3, 5, 8 hours trying to get across the border, it makes trade increasingly inefficient, or 2 days, or 3 days. When you have trucking that cannot go from one side to the other in an efficient way, it creates bottlenecks that undermine the potential competitiveness of the trading relationship. It also, and as someone who lived in border communities for a long time, it also undermines the border communities, the possibility to do regional development, to think how you can take advantage of the comparative advantages that border communities have. This is something that I think is very much on the radar screen. It's a question of how do we upgrade the infrastructure we have, how do we build some of the new infrastructure. Can we think of new public-private ventures that make it possible to speed ahead? Can we do pre-clearance of trucks, of individuals, so that when they get to the border they don't have to sit for hours? Use new technologies, GPS technologies, on trucks and trains so you can pre-clear things, and you're pretty confident by the time they get to the border that no one has dropped anything else on the shipment. There's a lot we can do, and I'm sure now actually CBP Commissioner Burson will say something about this in the next panel. Third is a small one, but it's an interesting niche, and Duncan Wood, who's I think back there, has written something about this that will come out next month. Renewable energy is a huge opportunity between the 2 countries, and particularly in the border region. Mexico has lots of opportunity. Wind power is one of the major ones, but there are a few others out there where it could develop renewable energy. The U.S. is going to increasingly be a consumer for this. And we're going to start to see, particularly in California, which has new regulations on how much of its electricity has to come from renewable sources, where Mexico could potentially be a producer of energy to the U.S. market. Now, there's still a market that needs to be filled in Mexico as well, so there's some politics involved in this. There's a lot of regulatory issues in how you make this happen, how you tie the grids together. It is not a simple issue, but it is something that the two governments are working on, and it has some potential to be a source of employment in Mexico. Maybe not a large one, but certainly an interesting one, a new niche that could contribute to employment opportunities. And let me throw out three sort of longer-term issues. One of them is agricultural policy in the United States. I mean, there's been a hollowing out of rural Mexico over the past 2 decades. This is primarily attributable to things happening in Mexico. That said, clearly the fact that Mexico's largest trading partner has heavily subsidized agricultural goods is not helpful for Mexican agricultural industries, and that's particularly harmful for very vulnerable parts of the population, to small farmers. Now, we're not about to have this debate again. We just went through the Farm Bill renewal. This is the same issue, however, that comes up with Brazil, that comes up with our partners around the world. The question of what we do about our agricultural subsidies ultimately has a huge impact on Mexico. And it's important, not just has a huge impact, but it has a huge impact on the most vulnerable populations that are most likely to migrate, that are most likely not to have other opportunities. So something to keep on the radar screen. 2, remittances. What more can we do with remittances and investment from migrants who have moved from Mexico to the United States? What can be done? And no one has found the magic bullet for this, but what can be done? There's actually great work on getting on migrant organizations taking leadership in raising money for their home communities. Recently, there are matching funds from Mexican federal, state, and local governments for this. But there has not yet been a systematic attempt to try and get this into productive enterprises. And there hasn't been a systematic attempt by either government, and have to be certainly Mexico taking the lead, but the U.S. could easily be a partner in this, in figuring out how you can creatively partner with migrants in the United States who probably aren't moving back, but to invest in their hometowns, in their home communities, in their home states in new and creative ways. Make it interesting for them to come back, at least with their investment, to places that they still love. And finally, let me throw out a really big idea, which is not mine at all, but belongs to Carol Weiss from the University of Southern California, which is, frequently in USMexico meetings, the idea of development funds come up. The idea of cohesion funds, the way the European Union transferred money. That's not something we're likely to do in the United States. It's not part of our DNA as a country. It's not a debate that is going to get a lot of traction in this country. And frankly, if it suddenly got traction in Congress, if we woke up tomorrow and there was a debate in the Senate about, we really want to, help our neighbors next door, let's come up with a giant, multi-billion-dollar cohesion fund, I don't think Mexico would want it. It would come with enough strings attached that on the other side of the border it would become completely unpalatable. But there is another way around this, actually, and it's worth thinking about in the long term, which is that, and this is Carol's idea, not mine, if Mexico were to do something so exciting, so interesting in development, perhaps taking excess petroleum reserves in a year where petroleum prices are high, doing what Chile's done with copper and nitrate, might be possible to create some sort of development authority, transparent, clear goals, target something effective, probably 1 or 2 things at most. The Mexican government would lead, but they could invite the U.S. and Canadian governments and international institutions to partner. Now, this strikes me, I love the idea of a cohesion fund. As someone who loves Mexico, it always strikes me, I would love to convince people here, this would be a great idea. I don't see it happening, but there are creative ways of doing this, and my sense is that to the extent that Mexico can lead in exciting new ways on development, there may be ways of finding opportunities to convince people in the U.S. and Canada and perhaps elsewhere to partner in this effort. And it certainly should be in our interest to think about how to do that.
Thanks, Andrew. Lots of food for thought. I'd like to turn to Tyler to get your reactions on some of the difficulties that Luis Rubio has explained to us in the Mexican political system and see how you react to that, given your earlier optimism. And perhaps we'll also throw that question to Andrew and then get Luis's reactions to some of your proposals, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Well, I agreed with Mr. Rubio's remarks. When I heard him talking about power lust everywhere, parties with intractable differences, widespread corruption in state and local governments. But at first I thought he was referring to my country. So this is a reality. It will be a reality. Political culture in Mexico could be better in a number of ways. But I would stress Andrew's point that as an outsider, you're less worried about the quality of the people who get in because you know less about them. And as an outsider, you think about how is Mexico in 1982 compared to today. You see the bigger picture. The question is the bigger picture or the more detailed picture more useful? I say for forecasting economic growth, you're better off with this focus on the bigger picture. And my wife is Russian. She has a lot of Russian friends. They're all very pessimistic. They know all the little things that are wrong. But when it comes to economic growth, I would just stress the bigger picture, a longer run of history, and there Mexico has a lot of very positive fundamentals.
I would just agree with that. I mean, I think over time the things are changing and moving forward. I see all the veto points that Luis does. I mean, I think this is a major issue in Mexico. I mean, and it is a heritage of the way of what was a very functional system for a very long time, a state that basically negotiated informal power arrangements with everyone from local political power holders to economic interests to union interests to, this was a system that doled out quotas of power. Over time, I see, on one hand, a state that's developing greater capacity to do things itself and to occasionally hold in check some of those interests, to begin to create formal power relationships rather than informal power relationships, rules and institutions. It's a slow process, it's an agonizing process. And I also see a society in Mexico that's less tolerant of this. I mean, and perhaps if there's anything that gives me optimism in Mexico, it's less the political debate and perhaps what you see on any range of issues, whether it's on organized crime and rule of law issues and justice, or it's on economic issues where you hear voices in society asking for change and coming up with new ideas and doing things on their own. And I think that's an exciting process.
The question I was asked to address was about the reform agenda now being discussed in Mexico and up for a congressional debate. And I stand by what I said. But that's not, the question I was asked was not whether Mexico, how has Mexico changed. I think that Mexico has turned several corners over the last several years. And it has done so successfully. The most important element in my view of why Mexico has basically held strong and tight to the core principles of a very orthodox economic policy is NAFTA, nothing else. That's what explains Mexico. NAFTA was conceived of for one specific purpose, and even though it's a trade and investment agreement, it was conceived of to sink in concrete, as it were, some basic reforms that had been passed early on in the late 80s. The idea was, how do we find something that would guarantee the continuation and the perpetuation of these policies, making it extremely expensive for any future government to break them. And that has held together extremely well. In fact, one of the worries in Mexico in the last couple of years has been whether the changes to NAFTA would come from the U.S., not in Mexico, ironically. So, just 3 comments. I think that there's no question whatsoever. If one looks back, it's absolutely astounding how Mexico has changed over the past 20 years. The country is different in any number of ways. There are some things that obviously don't work well, but the fact that there is literally absolute freedom of expression, for instance, stands in stark contrast with what happened when I started to write, and I had to to check on my back every single minute. That certainly no longer happens. Today, the opposite is true. It's the amount of horrendous things that are written and published every single day. It's a totally different type of panorama. 3 specific comments very quickly. One, Andrew, you mentioned that it takes 3 or 4 hours wait sometimes in the border. It used to take 3 or 4 weeks. So by that measurement, it's not bad. I forget which American rail company was in charge then, which is different from today on the Texas side, and they complained that they had turned the whole of Texas into a parking lot. This is the 1980s. That no longer happens, even despite everything else. Another interesting point, as you were talking about energy, I was reminded of something. In the 1980s, the Canadians had a big dispute with the Americans because of the way energy exports were recorded in the bilateral trade accounts. For some reason, I don't remember the details, but for some reason, energy coming from water or from non-oil sources or non-gas and oil sources was accounted one way, and coming from water was accounted in a different way. And for their provincial structure, those who were exporting energy in ways that were not oil and gas wanted everything to be registered as energy. Mexico is trying to do the opposite. Mexico is trying to concentrate energy just in oil because that's a state monopoly, so that to try private investment everywhere else. So we want to separate things in different ways. That's simply the differences in local issues. And finally, the only thing I would dispute, I think that there's no question that the remittances are a problem, and they have pernicious effects because they create dependence. Much, I think, of the consumption that you were registering probably has to do with remittances. And that's changed not only the people's welfare, but also their relationship with the local bosses, which also has changed the local structure of power in those societies. Mexicans come to the U.S. If you notice, they have ceased coming in those big numbers. They don't come because there is lack of opportunity in Mexico, even though that's true. They come because there is demand in the U.S. And they come to satisfy that demand. It's a perfect labor market. It has ever more complexities in crossing the border, but it's a perfect market. It's not they come when there is demand, and there are enough Mexicans here to call their friends or their brothers or their cousins whenever there's an opening, and that's how it works. It's a family network.
Well, thank you. I think there are many things that could be continued to be said, but we're going to cut a little bit into your coffee break and open this up to the floor for questions, if anybody has a question. Yes, do we have a microphone? Good, great, thanks.
George Grayson, I teach at the College of William and Mary, and I wanted to ask Luis if he could expand on his power issue and give us any hope that there might be a game changer. Because as you so rightfully point out, candidates for Congress are more often chosen by the party leaders. 40% of the House is not responsive to a particular geographic constituency. A third of the Senate. The governors now live almost, well, as you say, feudal lords. They don't have to worry about calls from Los Pinos or from Gobernacion, and I've had at least one governor say, maybe jokingly, that he would just as soon see the pawn stay in power because as a priista, he has the rule of the roost. I mean, in this country, Washington is dominated by special interest. Occasionally at the state legislature, something like Mothers Against Drunk Driving can succeed. At the local level, though, there are opportunities to affect school policy or transportation policy. But I just see the frustration of middle class and average Mexicans with regard to the impunity of politicians, and they feel impotent to be able to make any changes in the system. Is there a game changer that you could visualize?
The issue of power is one that politicians will have to settle amongst themselves. I don't think it's something that anybody can do much about. But I've come to believe over the last several years that what Mexico needs is a very strong leader that would have no personal interests, and I don't know if that exists, that would be capable of brokering such a deal. I think it's possible. I think it's conceivable, but I'm not sure it's anybody is there waiting for that. Most of Mexico's prominent politicians are not thinking along those lines. They're thinking in terms of how they will make it in life personally. How to break that vicious circle is the biggest question I think that Mexico has to face. In the absence of such leadership, smart, enlightened leadership, in the absence of that, then it would have to be a deal among Mexicans. There's an element of nostalgia in Mexico in all of this debate that has to do with two things. One is simply the nostalgia for the old system where things allegedly operated. If they had operated that well, then Mexico would be far richer, but that's a different story. But the other nostalgia is that Mexicans are not focusing on the things that need changing, because they are hopeful still today that an elegant solution like Spain's, meaning a consensus among the political forces, will come about. That already didn't happen. So Mexico has to start focusing in a different way. It's a messed up democracy, as somebody has called it. It has to find a way for not for the perfect deal, but for an arrangement that everybody can live with. And that's where Mexico has to move to. I think that the problem with Mexico is ultimately that still too many, certainly on the intellectual front, but too many politicians believe that a real deal, a consensus building effort can be made to transfer and change everything overnight. And I don't think it will happen. I think we need to go the old style backroom deals, to reach settlements on specific things that little by little keep on building.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. Perhaps the young lady. And if you could identify yourself, please.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Amelia Martinez. I come from Tec de Monterrey, Campus Guadalajara. First of all, I'm very happy to be with you today. And my question is, well, you mentioned that education is really important nowadays for Mexico. And I want to know what's your opinion on the role of women in economy, not only in the middle class, because nowadays more women are getting enrolled in university, but I mean like in high position, or like if you think that we can have, maybe aspire to have a women leader in politics.
The United States does a very good job mobilizing the productive efforts of its women, better than almost any other country in the world. But to your question and the previous question on Game Changer, I would cite actually Mexican immigration to the United States. I've never seen a serious estimate of the stock, the total number of Mexican people who have spent some time living in this country. And I'm full aware that when Mexicans come here illegally, they hardly see the most salubrious side of a lot of the United States. But nonetheless, I think it leaves a lasting impression. And quite simply, the number of Mexicans who have spent time living here is getting higher all the time. And I think both in politics and accountability and gender relations, and also women in politics, we're not so great on that ourselves, I might add. But that really is a big game changer in a lot of areas, and it will operate slowly, but it will operate.
Anybody else want to address that? Or should we? Let's go on. Let's have one more question and then the coffee break. All the way in the back.
The fourth pillar of, I'm sorry, I'm David Shirk. I'm a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center this year. The ambassador today mentioned the 4 pillars of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation, and the fourth pillar is building secure communities in Mexico. I'm wondering, as regions, in particular, Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez, 2 cities that have faced a lot of problems and violence in recent years, what is needed to build secure communities in those places along the border? What economically can be done to make them more secure?
And Andrew, do you want to?
Well, David, I don't think I have anything to add that you don't know already, because we've been traveling in Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez together. So,
but tell the rest of us.
But
traveling with
but it's
you.
a great question, so let me jump in. And I'm not sure we have an answer either from this. It's a great question because it looks like there is going to be an investment in the relationship between San Diego and Tijuana and El Paso and Juarez, beginning to think that fourth pillar, what they call resilient communities. How can we do things to give young people opportunities, to make communities more dynamic? Thinking that violence is a systemic question. It's not just a question of, yes, it's a question of organized crime groups doing their business. It's a question of the policy measures taken by the government. But it's also a question of the context that people live in, the opportunities they have, and whether societies can come together with some hope for the future. They're two very different pairs of cities. I would actually start with, oddly enough, the infrastructure, staffing. I mean, it sounds bureaucratic and it sounds like it has nothing to do with this. But one of the things that's happened is it's very hard for people to move back and forth in an efficient way between. That's particularly true of San Diego and Tijuana, more perhaps than El Paso Juarez. But actually, it's broken the bond between sides of the border. And it's actually significant in that way, finding ways that people can move back and forth. People can plan together. People can think of business opportunities together, which used to happen much more often. Secondly, I mean, there's a lot that can be done in terms of and this is true, particularly when you get outside of San Diego and Tijuana, which are very different cities and are physically a little bit far from each other, at least the center of gravity in both cities. Most other border towns are right next to each other, including Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. So thinking and people move back and forth. They have family ties on both sides of the border. I mean, the linkages are really very deep. Among most border cities other than San Diego and Tijuana where it's somewhat moderate. So thinking about how you take advantage of know-how and youth programs, addiction programs, all of that. And third is actually thinking about productive programs. I mean, how do you create jobs? And that's probably the hardest of all of these, particularly in a context of violence. You know, how do you attract investment? How do you get people to think that it's worthwhile to invest in those areas? But clearly that is something where you can think binationally, particularly if you can get people back and forth across the border. And there's some very interesting efforts happening on the ground. We see Plan Estratégico Juárez, a great group that's actually doing work, you know, in between Juárez and El Paso to try and develop a regional plan. Same thing has happened between San Diego and Tijuana. I mean, there are groups on the ground, there are civic groups that have been doing this for a long time where the ideas are. You know, you don't have to come in and sort of reinvent the wheel at the border because there are groups that have been thinking of this, you know, how do we take back our cities?
Well, great. Thank you very much. I think that's a perfect segue into the next panel on security and the war on drugs. I'd like to thank Luis Rubio, Andrew Seeley, and Tyler Cowan for a very interesting panel. And you now have about 4 minutes to go and get some refreshments and come back at 11:15 for the start of the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.